Well, we're going to have a great conversation this morning, and so I want to quickly introduce you to Associate Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law Center, Shon Hopwood. And so Shon's got an interesting story, Shon. So you're probably the first person who's ever sat on the stage that has robbed a bank, or five. You're probably also one of the few people, or actually, I'm sure you're the first person that has ever had a brief argued before the U.S. Supreme Court written on a prison typewriter. So talk a little bit about your experience, how you got there, what you were thinking, and let's go from there.
All right, here we go. So my name's Shon Hopwood, and I'll give you the intro that I use, no matter if I'm speaking before the President of the United States, to a Chamber of Commerce, or a church, which is, my name's Shon Hopwood. I'm an Associate Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law Center, and I committed a violent crime, but I am not a violent criminal. And the reason I give that introduction is to remind people that, character is not static, people change, and we should recognize that and advocate for second chances, even for people like myself who, you asked me what I was thinking back then in my 20s, and obviously I wasn't. Like a lot of young men, I was pretty reckless and young and immature and, just did not think about consequences and did not do a great job of controlling impulses, and that led me to robbing 5 banks. And fortunately, no one was hurt, but I ended up serving nearly 11 years in federal prison as a result. Unfortunately for me, when I got to prison, I found a passion for the law, started learning the law on my own, and wrote 2 briefs to the Supreme Court of the United States that were granted, which, to give you an idea of how unlikely that is, a person in federal prison filing one of these briefs has about a 1% of 1% chance of getting the Supreme Court to hear one of those cases. And so I found a passion for the law and found a passion for helping other people in prison, and it changed my life.
So walk us through what led to the bank robberies. How did that start? I think it's important that we kind of build that context of kind of what led up to that point.
Yeah, well, I think most Americans think when somebody breaks the law, they must be a bad person. I did bad things, but I wouldn't say that I was necessarily a bad person. I grew up in a household that, was not much different from anything else. So in that respect, I didn't really have any excuses for what I had done. I knew right from wrong. But I was running with a group of young men, and none of us had any idea what we wanted to do with our lives. And when you don't really consider the consequences of your actions on yourself, it's pretty easy to forget the consequences of your actions for anyone else.
So talk a little bit about your 11 years in federal prison and a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, so the first thing I realized about prison was I did not like it. There were not many good things in prison. The food was not good. I grew up in Nebraska. My dad managed feed yards most of his life. I like steak a whole lot. They do not have steak in prison. And it's, this environment where you are pulled out of your community and put into isolation, and there's the ever-present threat of violence, and there's just not a lot of hope. When I was in federal prison, they did not have many programs. They basically just warehouse people, sometimes for 10 or 20 years, and then they would kick people out to the streets with no job skills, with social skills that, well, I always give this example. In prison, when you get into conflict, you know what you do? You never de-escalate. Someone gets up and yells in your face, you get up and yell in their face louder, because if you're viewed as soft, people will rape, rob, and steal from you. So imagine, for the women in the audience, how that plays out when I got out and got married. Not very well. And so, people coming out of prison have a hard time with simple things like social skills and managing a checking account and things of that nature.
So you get out of prison and you go to a halfway house and you have to get a bank account. Walk us through a little bit of the process of just somebody who has just gotten out after serving 11 years, and you're kind of getting your first taste of freedom at a halfway house, and you're told to go get a job and a bank account.
Yeah, most people I served time with, very few people I saw thought or said out loud that I can't wait to get out of prison to go back and doing what I was doing that landed me in prison. Most of the people I served time with, the vast majority, wanted to get out and do the right thing, but it's not always that easy. So I get out to a halfway house, and I'm told I can't get a pass to leave the halfway house until I get a job, and I can't get a job until I get a bank account. Well, I go to the bank, and I apply to get an account, and the first thing the person says is, well, the credit agencies have you listed as deceased. And I said, well, I strenuously disagree. He was like, you haven't banked, it looks like, in 11 years. Why is that? And I said, well, because I've been in federal prison. And he starts typing, and I said, you can ask me. And he's like, so what'd you do? And it's at that point I realized I made a horrific mistake. Because the last thing a former bank robber wants to say in a bank is the word robbery out loud. But to my surprise, I said, well, I robbed a couple banks. And he said, oh, cool. And he went back to typing. I wasn't able to get a bank account that day. When I went back to the halfway house, they said, you need to hire a lawyer to get this straightened out. And I said, let me get this straight. I've just done nearly 11 years in federal prison. I can't get out of the halfway house until I get a job. I can't get a job till I get a bank account. And now you're telling me I have to pay a bunch of money to a lawyer just so that I can get the bank account. Well, how do you expect me to do that? And ultimately, it was a lawyer who fixed this problem for me for free. But if I didn't have that resource, it would have been really hard for me to just get on my feet and get that bank account so that I could get a job and get on with my life.
So when did you discover this penchant for the law? And you were working in the law library, and walk us through that.
Yeah, well, a lot of people say that my first profession was more honorable than my current profession. I get that joke a lot at events. But my passion for the law came when I was working in a prison law library, and the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a decision that I, along with everyone else in federal prison, thought could apply to us and could lead to a sentence reduction. And let me tell you, there is no bigger motivator for people in prison than the thought of early release. It's one of the reasons why I champion putting in rehabilitation programs into prisons and tying that to the incentive of early release. It's one of the things that we did with the Federal First Step Act that I watched President Trump sign last year. And so, I found this passion for working on my own case and found that I kind of enjoyed the law and it was challenging, and I started writing briefs for other prisoners. And now it's kind of strange that I am teaching at one of the world's premier law schools right down the corner from. My office is literally a block and a half from the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. How's that for irony?
So you get involved with the Federal First Step Act, and with President Trump signed into 2018. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience? I'm sure it was uniquely personal to you, and what lessons did you learn from that?
That I'd like to leave the politics to people like you, Senator Brandis. Trying to get a criminal justice bill through the Congress was one of the most challenging things I've ever been a part of. And the coalition that had to be assembled to just get what I say, the first step is two things at once. On the one hand, it's very modest reform, and that it will fix some things, but it's not going to fix the problem we have of too many criminal laws. Anybody in here know how many federal criminal laws there are? Anybody want to take a guess? No one knows with certainty, but we know it's over 5,000. There are over 5,000 things that the U.S. Congress said is so dangerous that it could warrant putting you in jail or prison. And there are also about 300,000 federal regulations that carry criminal penalties. And so when you go up to the Congress to try and talk them into criminal justice reform, knowing that for the last 30 years, all they have done is pass more criminal laws after more criminal laws after more criminal laws, it's just very difficult. And fortunately, we had great leadership from the president, from Jared Kushner and particularly from Senator Chuck Grassley, the senator from Iowa, who really championed both prison reform and sentencing reform. And ultimately, we got it done. 87 votes in the U.S. Senate for criminal justice reform. To say that out loud always just brings a smile to my face, because criminal justice reform truly is one of the last bipartisan issues in America. And it was great to see the Congress come together to basically make us all safer and reducing recidivism of people that are coming out of prison. We know that 95% of people that are sentenced to prison are one day coming back to the community. 600,000 people are released from prisons in the United States every year. And so knowing that, it seems to me it's incumbent upon us to make sure they come out better off, not worse.
So now, as a professor, you teach kind of prison law, and you get to go in and look at the research and the studies. And so, talk a little bit about kind of some of the myths. For example, do mandatory minimums work?
No, there is no proof. Not only do mandatory minimums not work, but the more data we have, economists, political scientists, and criminologists have all studied this, and what they found is that the link between the number of people we put in prison and the crime rate is not nearly as strong as we thought. And in fact, over 30 states in the last 10 years have reduced the prison population of their state and watched crime still continue to come down. And so there's a belief that, we don't need things like the heavy hand of mandatory minimums and long sentences in order to keep us safe. And in fact, most economists and criminologists would say the number of people we're putting into prison, because prison tends to make people worse, not better, may actually be contributing to crime, not decreasing it.
So what are some other common myths that are out there I've heard you say, look, the first 5 years that you did was, you felt like you deserved it. In the last 5 years, you just felt like you were warehoused. Are we just a system that just warehouses people? Is that what our prison system does today?
We do a lot of that. And what we do is we warehouse people, and they have no, one of the things I had real difficulty with when I got out, I had never been on the internet. Never seen an iPhone, an iPod, an iPad. One of the first things I realized was people don't advertise jobs in the classified ads section of the paper anymore. That had kind of passed me by. When you're in prison, you're not really looking at the classified sections a whole lot. And so, we don't do a great job of preparing people for success after release, and it really starts inside prison. And then the other myth is that, we think of when someone served their time, they get a second chance. But rarely is that the case. The speaker before talked about occupational licensing schemes. When people come out of prison, there are several 100,000 collateral consequences of a felony conviction. You can be legally discriminated against in housing, employment, public benefits, and a whole host of things, including occupational licensing schemes. So when people come out of prison, they don't get a true second chance, because that stigma of that conviction follows them the rest of their life, particularly in the Google age. People ask me all the time, why don't you ask the president for a pardon? And I said, well, that's not really going to help me when some parent of a kid that goes to school with my kids is thinking about sending their kids over for a play date, and they Google my name. I'm not certain that a pardon will make them feel any better when they see I had committed the 5 armed bank robberies. And so, we really have to reevaluate whether these collateral consequences are worth it, because we want people to be incentivized to get out and do the right things.
So sitting in the room today are some of the top business leaders in the state of Florida. How can the business community engage in the prison reform, criminal justice reform efforts, specifically as it relates to reentry?
Yeah, well, I think the business community can play a huge role. We always, with criminal justice reform, tend to look at government and passing more laws or getting rid of some laws. But honestly, without buy-in from the business community, I don't think it will be as successful as it could be. And one of the things I would encourage you all to think about is second chance hiring. We have all of these legislative agendas all over the country to ban the box. the box where you have to check the felony conviction on the application. But if at the end of the day you find out through the interview that they have a felony and you don't hire them, then ban the box is not going to work. I would love to see the business community affirmatively come out and say, we're going to be in the business of second chances. We're going to hire people coming out of prison. Just last weekend, JP Morgan announced that they're going to do second chance hiring. Coke Industries has long been a champion of second chance hiring, and I think if you talk to them, they would say that people coming out of prison have been some of the best employees they've had because they are very grateful for the opportunity and the second chance, and they're very, very diligent. And so to the extent that you can get involved with second chance hiring, please do so. Not only will you help make communities safer, but you're going to change lives and strengthen families.
So during your, thank you. So during your term of incarceration, you got to see some of the workforce programs going on inside the prison systems, and I think you had a warden that changed the workforce program. Tell us about what we should be thinking as we're putting together and working with the business community to put together programs in the prison system.
Yeah, so, not every decision that's made inside prison systems are the right decisions. And I always give the example of, in the prison I was at, we had a welding program. It's quite successful. This is a skill that if you get out, and even with a felony conviction, if you can weld really well, people will hire you. I had friends that got out and were welding for $25 an hour, which honestly, for people coming out of prison, that's the gold standard. And a new warden came in and found out that he could get more money if he changed the programs. And he changed and took out the welding program and replaced it with an associate degree program in business management. Because we all know that people want to hire people coming out of prison to run and manage their businesses every day. Did not seem like the best of moves. And so we really have to get the business community and public and private partnerships to go into the prisons and train people so that when they come out, they are ready to go to work. And I have seen that work in places like Texas, in California, and I think it could work very well here as well.
So obviously we have a huge problem nationwide with recidivism, and it's one of the areas I know you focus on and study a lot on. Talk a little bit about what the data and the research shows works to reduce recidivism.
Yeah, we know what works. I mean, someone gets out and finds stable employment and stable housing, the recidivism rate plummets. If you then partner that with substance abuse treatment and mental health treatment, so many of the people I was incarcerated with had substance abuse problems that led them to going down a path of crime. And also, over the last 10, 20 years, states have shuttered mental health facilities all over the place, and at the same time built prisons. And there is certainly some correlation there. Many of the people I served time with had mental health issues. They were not adequately treated in prison, and we need to make sure that they are adequately treated out of prison. Again, because if people are not recidivating, it makes our community safer. And, when we spend a little bit of money to ensure that they don't commit a new offense, we save a lot of money on the back end when we don't have to re-prosecute them. We don't have to pay for the prosecutor, the judge, and the public defender, and then we don't have to pay to reincarcerate them. It's, about anywhere between $30,000 to $60,000 a year to house one person in prison for 1 year. We could put that money to good use other places and make our community safer at the same time.
So how do we get how do we work with the business community to kind of move away from the kind of so-called tough on crime policies to more smart on crime? And what does that look like for us? What states are doing it well, and who do we kind of lean on as an example?
Well, I think Texas and Georgia are good examples of states that reevaluated their criminal justice policy, started putting programs into the prisons, started actually closing prisons, and getting some of the people that were no longer a danger out. I mean, all the social science data tends to tell us that people age out of crime. Young men commit bank robberies. 44-year-olds with bellies and wives and kids at home do not go rob banks. And that's true across the board. So when we take someone and we incarcerate them past their 20s and 30s and into a place where, they're in their 40s, the data says people just aren't out committing crimes again. And so it takes reform up front of sentencing, not putting people in prison so long, not having as many people in prison. But when we do put people in prison, and when we do use it as a last resort, we make sure that there are rehabilitation programs in the prison system so that when people come out, they're coming out ready for success and not coming out trying to find a job and being on that borderline between, homelessness or having to go to crime. Most of the people I saw that got out and committed new offenses, it was because they couldn't find work, they couldn't find stable housing, they didn't get treatment for their mental health issues, and they went back to crime not because they wanted to, but almost out of necessity.
So in our last few minutes, I always tell people that most of my job is asking people what their vision is for what they want to accomplish and who their champion is in the legislative process to work on with. So cast me a vision for what the prison system should really look like, or kind of the broader criminal justice system should look like.
Yeah, I think more focus on rectifying the harms that are caused by the crimes. One of the things I do a lot is talk to victims of crime, and they are not happy about the system of justice we have, because what often happens is the harm that's caused by the defendant is never remedied. And what's astonishing to me is at no point in the criminal justice system does the defendant have to look at the victims and say, you know what, here are the factors that led me to committing this crime. I'm sorry that I committed this crime. How can I fix it? And what can I do today and tomorrow to make sure that this never happens again? I didn't find those questions out until 4 or 5 years into my sentence, and didn't have a chance to talk to the victims until just a couple of years ago. I would like to see more of this restorative justice where we fix the harms, and then when we do send people to prison, and sometimes we have to incapacitate people to keep us safe, we don't focus so much on punishment. We focus on actually fixing the root causes of the problem so that when that person gets out, they're not committing new offenses. And if we did that, I think you would see a system that values individual liberty, values human dignity, and strives to fix problems rather than just taking people out of their community, throwing them into a prison and forgetting about them. That may work if no one's ever coming home, but again, 600,000 people coming out of American prisons every year. And so we really need to get a handle on how to make them come out and have success.
So America is the land of liberty. Are we the land of liberty as it relates to the prison system?
No, I don't think you can say that. You can't say we are the land of liberty on one hand and know on the other that we incarcerate people in this country at a greater rate than almost any other country on the planet. We are the world's leader in putting people in prison. It's shameful. The 113 million Americans have had someone in their close and immediate family go to jail or prison within their lifetime. That should not happen in a country that prides itself on liberty and has a Bill of Rights that's supposed to make it difficult for government to incarcerate people. And again, if I thought this was actually tied to the crime rate and helping to reduce crime, I'd still be arguing that it's unjust. But we now know, people that study this on a macro level know that it's not fixing our crime problem, and that we could drastically reduce the number of people in prison and still watch crime go down. And to the extent we should do that, as a country, again, that values individual liberty, we should be doing it.
So I've heard you say that that prison is a horrible place that actually harms people that go there, deeply psychologically harms them and creates trauma in their life that's really hard for them to overcome. Talk a little bit about that, and then why it's so important that we create this off-ramp to prison via diversion.
Yeah, I love to cite the statistic when I'm laying in bed with my wife that after someone served over 7 years of imprisonment, it's permanent psychological damage. And then I tell her that, and I say, but I only served 11, so we ought to be okay. Now, almost everyone I talk to that comes out of prison has traumatized by being in prison and being in that environment. I work a lot with veterans. who have gone to prison themselves in part because they have PTSD from war that's been untreated. And a lot of them tell me that the trauma from being in prison, away from your family, in this danger zone for years on end, was as traumatic as going to war. And so that's not a system that fixes the harms. It's a Band-Aid on a larger problem. And again, we know what works. We just sometimes have lacked the political will to create a system that actually gets at root problems and root issues and is not just focused on punishment. I'm the least punitive person in the room, but I get it, because you know what? As soon as my kids misbehave, I want to bring down the hammer. But it doesn't fix the problems with my kids' misbehaviors. It might make me feel good in the moment, but it doesn't fix the problems. And it's kind of the same way with the criminal justice system. And sending people to prison and warehousing them and then expecting a miracle when they come out is not a viable system long term.
Well, thanks, Shon. Thanks for your advocacy, and thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you, Senator Brandes.